The brick was cold under my palm, and that's what struck me first, not the dust, not the silence of the house, but how cold it felt for something that used to hold fire. My name is Augustine Pell, and for 30 years I have lived in this house on a quiet street in Birmingham, married to a man I thought I knew completely. That night, none of what was coming had happened yet. I only knew I wanted to give my husband something beautiful to come home to. Sherrod had been gone 12 days on business, with 2 more before his flight back, and I'd decided I would use that window to surprise him. Our fireplace had sat neglected for years, the brick chipped and dulled, the mantel scarred from decades of use. I called a contractor, got a quote, and sat with it in my lap at the kitchen table like it was a love letter I was working up the nerve to send. I told Theo about it that Sunday over dinner, expecting him to smile the way he always does when I throw myself into a project. Instead, my son went still, fork halfway to his mouth, eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder. "Don't do it, Mama." I laughed. Because what else do you do with a sentence like that? Dropped flat into the middle of a Sunday dinner. "Don't do what, Theo?" "Fix up my own living room." He set the fork down. "Just leave it alone. Get the kitchen redone instead. Anything else?" I asked him why, half teasing, half curious whether some old superstition of his father's family had finally rubbed off on him. He opened his mouth like he had an answer ready, then closed it, shook his head. "It's probably nothing," he said. "Dad always got weird whenever anybody talked about changing that fireplace." I frowned. "Weird how?" Theo shrugged immediately, almost too quickly. "I don't know. Just weird." Then he waved a hand like he regretted saying even that much. Said it was part of the house, and ought to stay the way it was. That's all. He looked down at his plate. A moment later, he was talking about old wiring, old houses, things best left undisturbed. Then he picked his fork back up and asked about my hospice rounds like the last 30 seconds hadn't happened at all. That was the part that sat wrong with me. Not the warning itself. People get strange about old houses, about change, about disturbing what's settled. It was how fast he dropped it, like a man closing a door before you can see what's on the other side of it. I let it go because that's what you do with your grown son when he's tired and doesn't want to explain himself. I went home, and I called the contractor back, and I booked him to start in 3 days, well inside the window before Sherrod's flight. Plenty of time to surprise him with something finished and beautiful. If you're watching this right now, tell me in the comments what time it is for you. Because where I'm sitting telling you this, it's well past midnight, and sleep hasn't come easy since the night I'm about to tell you about. That night, after Theo left, I found myself standing in the living room in the dark, the way you do when a house feels different than it did that morning. I walked over to the fireplace and laid my hand flat against the brick. Still cold. Still ordinary, far as my eyes could tell, but my hand didn't want to leave it. Some part of me, the part that spent 30 years reading rooms, reading faces, reading the silence after someone says something they didn't mean to say, that part of me stood there feeling like I had my palm pressed against something sleeping. Something that had been sleeping a long, long time. I told myself it was nerves. Big projects do that to a person. I didn't know yet that in 3 days I'd be standing in this exact spot, watching a man I'd hired pull something out of that wall that had been waiting for me a lot longer than 3 days. Dust hung in the air like fog by 10 in the morning, and I stood in the doorway of my own living room wondering if I'd made a mistake letting a stranger take a hammer to something that had stood there longer than my marriage. The contractor's name was Mr. Eddings, an older man with steady hands and a voice that didn't waste words. He'd peeled back the outer layer of brick within the first hour, working in slow, careful sections so the chimney above wouldn't shift. I'd pulled a chair into the doorway and watched, telling myself I was just being a good hostess, bringing him water, but really, I just didn't want to. Leave the room. Around noon, he stopped working and stood back, wiping his hands on his jeans, looking at the wall like it had said something to him. "This is strange," he said. "This facing here, it's doubled up. 2 layers of brick where there should only be 1. I came closer, looking at where he pointed. Sure enough, there was a thin seam running behind the visible brick, like someone had built a second wall just inside the first. "Doubled up how?" I asked. "Added later. Not original to the house." He knocked his knuckle against it, and the sound came back hollow in one spot, solid everywhere else. "There's a gap back there. Could be nothing. Could just be how they shored up the chimney years back." I felt something tighten low in my stomach, but it didn't feel like fear yet. It felt like curiosity pulling at a thread. "Open it," I said. He looked at his watch, then at the dust still settling around us. "I was thinking I'd pack up for the day, come back tomorrow with the right tools to do it clean." "Mr. Eddings, I have 11 days left before my husband comes home, and I'd like my fireplace finished by then." That wasn't the real reason I wanted him to keep going, and some part of me knew it even as I said it. "Can we just see what's back there? Please." He studied me a moment, the way men sometimes do when a woman's voice gets a little too even, a little too controlled. Then he shrugged and picked his tool back up. "Your house." It took him another 20 minutes, working a flathead tool along the seam, prying gently so the brick wouldn't crack. I stood close enough to smell the dust and old mortar, my arms crossed tight against my chest like I was cold, though the house was warm. Then a section gave way all at once, brick sliding loose and clattering onto the hearth, and behind it opened a small, dark cavity, no bigger than a shoebox, built into the chimney wall itself. Mr. Eddings stepped back to let me look, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The space was clean, dry, untouched by anything resembling decades of fire and heat, which told me, even before I understood why it mattered, that whoever built this knew exactly how to keep something safe from the very thing this room was made for. I leaned down with the flashlight from my phone, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, and that's when I saw it. Something pale, wrapped in cloth, sitting deep in the dark like it had been waiting. I told Mr. Eddings to go on home for the day, that I'd clean up the dust myself, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I intended, because he didn't argue. He just packed his tools, told me he'd be back tomorrow to finish the brickwork proper, and left me standing alone in a room full of settling dust and one small, dark hole in my chimney wall. I waited until I heard his truck pull off the street before I moved. Kneeling at the hearth, I reached into the cavity and lifted the bundle out, and it was heavier than I expected, heavy in a way that made me adjust my grip without thinking. Oilcloth, the kind used to keep moisture out, wrapped tight and tied with a length of twine that had gone stiff and brittle with age, but hadn't broken. As I turned it over, one corner of the cloth shifted slightly, just enough for something pale underneath to show through. Not much. The edge of what looked like old paper. A photograph, maybe. That tiny glimpse changed something. If it had been money, or documents, or some forgotten keepsake, I might have opened it right there in the dust, with Mr. Eddings standing over my shoulder. But a photograph felt different. Personal. Like something that belonged first to whoever had hidden it before it belonged to me. I sat back on my heels, holding it in both hands, and noticed my fingers were trembling slightly against the cloth. I don't startle easy. 30 years sitting with families in their worst hours taught me how to keep my hands steady when everything inside me wanted to shake. So when my own hands betrayed me over a bundle of cloth and twine, I took it as information, the same way I'd take a patient's blood pressure as information. Something in me already knew this mattered before my mind caught up to why. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it down, staring at it the way you'd stare at an envelope you weren't sure you wanted to open. Sherrod was still 2 states away, 11 days into his trip with one more to go before he'd be home, and some old habit in me, wife habit, the kind you don't examine too closely, said I should wait. Open it together. Let him be there for whatever this was, since it came out of our house, our wall, our marriage. But another part of me, quieter and a little more honest, didn't trust that instinct at all. That part of me wanted to know what was in my hands before anyone else had the chance to tell me what I was looking at. I sat with that pull for longer than I want to admit, the kitchen clock ticking through a silence that felt thicker than it should have for an empty house on a Tuesday afternoon. In the end, I didn't open it. Not because I decided to wait for him. If I'm honest with myself now, looking back, I think I was scared of what my own hands might find before I was ready to find it. So I wrapped it back in its own cloth, carried it upstairs, and laid it in the bottom drawer of my dresser, underneath a stack of scarves I never wear anymore. I told myself I'd open it tonight, alone, once the house went quiet, and I could give it the kind of attention it seemed to be asking for. Closing that drawer, my hand still resting on the wood, I heard Theo's voice again, clear as if he were standing right behind me in that bedroom. "Don't do it, Mama." 3 words. No explanation. Said too fast and dropped too quickly to be nothing. I stood there a long moment, hand pressed flat against the drawer, wondering for the first time all day if my son had known something I didn't. The house went quiet around 11. The kind of quiet that only comes when you live alone for a stretch and the walls finally stop pretending someone else might still be moving through them. I sat on the edge of my bed with the bundle in my lap, the scarves I'd hidden it under still pushed to one side of the open drawer. I'd told myself all evening I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was simpler than that. I was waiting until I was too tired to talk myself out of it. I untied the twine first. Careful. The way you handle something that might fall apart in your hands if you rush it. The oilcloth came open in folds, stiff at the creases, and inside lay 2 things I wasn't prepared for. A ring, first. Old cut stone, set in a thick band that felt heavier in my palm than my own ring had any business feeling after 30 years of marriage. I turned it slowly under my bedside lamp, watching light catch in the facets in a way that felt different from anything I owned. Beneath it, folded twice, a photograph. I opened it carefully along its worn creases and found a young woman staring back at me, unsmiling, her hand resting against her collarbone in that posed way people did decades ago. On her finger, the same ring. Or one enough like it that my stomach didn't bother waiting for proof. I didn't know her face. Not from church, not from any photograph in our own albums, not from anywhere I could place. I sat there turning that fact over, more confused than frightened, the way you feel flipping past a chapter of a book you didn't realize you'd missed. I turned the photograph over, hoping for a name, and found one. Ink faded to a brown so pale it had nearly surrendered to the paper itself. I tilted it toward the lamp, narrowed my eyes, made out 2 or 3 letters before the rest dissolved into nothing I could read with any certainty. Whoever she was, time had decided to keep her mostly to itself. What I could read clearly was the ring itself, once I looked closer at the setting beneath the stone. A small engraved detail, a kind of crest worked into the metal, and I'd seen that exact mark once before, years back, at a Pell family gathering, on a piece of jewelry an older relative wore to Sherrod's mother's anniversary dinner. I remembered it because I'd complimented it, and the conversation that followed had gone on far longer than I expected. 3 different relatives ended up arguing over who was supposed to inherit it one day, before somebody finally laughed and called it an old family thing, and changed the subject. I sat with that for a long moment, the photograph in one hand, the ring in the other, feeling the shape of a thought I didn't yet have words for. Not fear, exactly. something more specific than fear. A name circling just outside the edge of what I let myself think. My eyes drifted, almost on their own, down to my left hand, to the ring I'd worn every day for 30 years, without once really studying it the way I was studying this one. I held my hand up under the lamp, turning it the way I had turned the other ring just minutes before, and looked at my own wedding ring for the first time in longer than I could say, like I was seeing a stranger's hand wearing it. Pauletta's kitchen always smells like coffee and cut lemons, and that morning I sat down at her table and realized I'd been white-knuckling that bundle in my purse since I left my own house, like it might try to get away from me. I hadn't told her anything on the phone, just that I needed to come by before she left for her shift. She took one look at my face when she opened the door and didn't ask a single question, just stepped back and let me in, the way you do for family when you can already tell it's not a social visit. I set the ring and the photograph on her table between the coffee cups, and I told her everything in order. The cavity in the wall, the weight of that bundle in my hands, the name I couldn't read, the crest I recognized from a Pell family dinner years back. Then I told her what Theo had said over Sunday dinner, word for word, the way it had stuck itself somewhere I couldn't shake it loose from. Pauletta didn't say anything for a long moment. She picked up the ring, turned it once under the kitchen light, and set it back down with a care that wasn't like her at all. My cousin talks with her hands, fills silences before they have a chance to settle. That morning, she let the silence sit there between us like a third person at the table. Augustine. She said my name slow, testing it. Tell me again what Sherrod told you happened to your ring. The real story, not the short version you give people at church. I opened my mouth to answer the way I always had. A break-in, early in our marriage, before Theo was even born. Jewelry taken along with some cash from the dresser. But sitting there, trying to find the details underneath that sentence, I came up empty in a way that unsettled me more than the ring itself had. He said it happened while I was at my mother's for the weekend, I said slowly. He came home, found the back door open, some things gone. Police come out? I started to say yes automatically and then stopped, because I couldn't actually picture an officer in our house, couldn't picture a report, a card with a badge number, any of it. I don't know. He handled all of that. Told me not to worry myself with it. Pauletta's eyebrows lifted slightly, and she didn't say anything else right away, just reached for her coffee and held it without drinking. I remember somebody saying, years back, that the police never actually got called on that, she said finally, careful with every word. I didn't think much of it at the time. People talk. But I remember it. Something cold moved through my chest, settling low, turning what had been confusion since last night into something with sharper edges now. Something closer to suspicion than I wanted to admit out loud in my own cousin's kitchen. Pauletta reached over and tapped the ring once with her finger, then looked up at me steady, no teasing left in her voice at all. Baby, you need to get that ring looked at. She nodded toward my left hand. Both of them. Marguerite Holt's shop sat tucked between a tailor and a shuttered bakery, the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without noticing unless someone sent you there directly, the way Pauletta had sent me. I sat across from her at a small table in the back, away from the front window, both rings resting on a square of black velvet, between us like two suspects waiting on a verdict. Marguerite was a small, precise woman, maybe 60, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and hands that moved like she'd done this exact motion 10,000 times before. She picked up my wedding ring first, the one I'd worn every day for 30 years, and brought a loop to her eye, turning it slowly under the lamp clipped to her desk. She said, which told me nothing. Then she set it down and picked up the other one, the one from the wall, and her movements slowed just slightly, a fraction of a second I might not have caught if I hadn't spent 30 years in hospice work learning to read the small things people's bodies do before their mouths catch up. She reached for a different tool this time, something small and electronic with a thin probe, and touched it to each stone in turn. Watching a little readout I couldn't see from where I sat. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Instead of speaking, Marguerite reached beneath the table and pulled out another instrument, this one fitted with a small magnifying screen. She examined my ring again, then the other. Only after that did she set both pieces back onto the velvet. Marguerite folded her hands and looked at me for a moment before she spoke, and something about that pause told my body to brace before my mind had decided what for. "I want to ask you something first," she said gently. "How long have you worn this one?" She nodded toward my own ring, still resting on the velvet. 30 years. Since my wedding." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer and wished she hadn't. "Mrs. Pell, this stone," she touched my ring without picking it up again, "is a cubic zirconia. A very good one. Whoever set this knew what they were doing because it's fooled appraisers less careful than me. But it's not a diamond. It never was." I heard the words clearly enough, but they sat outside me for a second, like she'd been talking about someone else's hand, someone else's marriage. "And this one," she continued, finally lifting the ring from the wall, turning it so the old cut stone caught the light, "is real. Old cut. The kind they don't make anymore, and considerably more valuable than anything I'd guess you were told to expect from whatever this was wrapped up in." I didn't say anything. I don't think I could have, even if I'd had words ready. Marguerite studied the setting a moment longer, running her thumb along the engraved detail beneath the stone, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped, quieter, almost to herself. "This setting work," she said, turning it once more under the light. "I haven't seen this style outside of estate pieces from the 60s. Old money made these, the kind of families who had a jeweler on retainer, not a store they walked into." She looked up at me then, waiting, and I realized she could see something on my face I hadn't given myself permission to feel yet. The front door opened at 6 that evening, suitcase wheels catching on the threshold the way they always did, and I stood in the kitchen doorway watching my husband step into our living room, for the first time, in 12 days. Sherrod set his bag down without looking at it, his eyes going straight to the fireplace, and for a moment he just stood there, taking it in. The new brick, cleaned and reset. The mantel, sanded smooth and stained dark the way I'd always wanted it. "Augustine." He said my name the way he does when something genuinely catches him off guard, a kind of breath behind it. "You did all this yourself?" "Hired it out," I said, watching him cross the room toward it. "But I picked everything, stood over that man's shoulder the whole time." He laughed, warm, easy, the laugh I'd fallen for 30 years ago, and he kept walking until he was standing right in front of it, hands on his hips, head tilted like he was admiring a painting in a gallery. "It's beautiful, baby. Really. I mean that." He shook his head slightly. "I leave for less than 2 weeks and come home to a whole new room." I stood in the doorway a beat too long, watching him the way I'd learned to watch families in hospital hallways, looking for the gap between what a face says and what a body does underneath it. He was smiling. His voice carried every note of a man genuinely pleased, but something about the stillness in his shoulders didn't match the warmth coming out of his mouth. He didn't ask how the demolition went, didn't ask what they found behind the old brick, whether anything had surprised the contractor, whether the chimney structure underneath had needed any extra work. For a man who normally wanted every detail of any project in this house, who'd once spent 40 minutes questioning a roofer about shingle brands, the silence around the actual work itself sat strange in my chest. He stepped closer to the mantel and ran his palm along the new wood, slow, deliberate. Then his hand drifted lower, toward the brick itself, fingers pressing flat against the surface the way you'd press against a door to check whether it was locked. it wasn't admiration. I know what admiration looks like on a man's hands. 30 years of watching him touch things he loved. This was something else. This was checking. Strong, he said quietly, almost to himself, more than to me. They did good work. I said something back, I don't even remember what. Some agreeable nothing. Because my mind had already moved past the conversation and into a decision I didn't announce out loud, not even to myself in so many words. I wasn't going to tell him. Not yet. Not until I understood what I was looking at. That night, after he'd showered off 12 days of travel and gone to bed, I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, even out into sleep. And once I was sure, I got up quiet, found my keys, and carried both rings out to the car wrapped in an old church bulletin from my purse. I tucked them deep in the glove box, underneath the registration papers, and sat there a moment in the dark driveway, engine off, asking myself why I suddenly didn't trust my own house to keep something safe. 3 days passed, the way water sits still right before it starts to boil. Everything on the surface looking exactly like our marriage always had. Sherrod went back to his routine, coffee at 6, the news on low while he checked his email, a kiss on my temple on his way out the door each morning. I went back to mine, hospice rounds, dinner started before he got home, the same rhythm we'd kept for 30 years. Nobody watching us would have seen anything different. But I was watching him now in a way I hadn't before. And I noticed things I might have let pass a week earlier. The way his eyes drifted to the fireplace more than they used to. Quick glances he probably didn't even know he was making. The way he'd touched that mantle twice more since the day he got home. Always, when he thought I was occupied with something else. That Thursday morning, I was at the counter pouring coffee when he asked it. Voice pitch so casual, it almost slid past me. Everything come out all right in there? He didn't look up from his phone, thumb scrolling. Find anything in that old wall? Or was it just dust and old brick, like we figured? My heart did something sharp and sudden in my chest. A drop I felt all the way down into my stomach. But I'd spent 30 years standing at hospital bedsides, keeping my face steady for families who needed me calm more than they needed me honest. I kept pouring his coffee like the question hadn't landed anywhere at all. Just dust and old brick, I said. Mr. Eddings said the chimney was solid underneath, no surprises. I set the mug down in front of him and made myself look at his face instead of away from it, because looking away would have told him more than any lie I could speak out loud. His shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, nothing another wife might have caught after 30 years of not really looking. But I saw it. The way the tension that had been sitting quiet in him for days finally let go. His whole upper body settling an inch lower in his chair. Good, he said. And he smiled, reaching for the mug. Glad it wasn't more than you bargained for. Old houses. You never know what's back there. He said it light, almost cheerful, dressing the relief up as relief about contractors and budgets and renovation headaches, the kind of thing any homeowner might say. But I'd just watched a man's body tell the truth. His mouth had no intention of telling, and there was no unseeing it now. I knew, sitting there across from him with my own coffee going cold in my hands, that my husband had known something was behind that wall. Not suspected. Known. The relief in his shoulders wasn't about renovation budgets at all. I told him I needed to get ready for my shift, voice even, movements unhurried, and walked myself down the hallway like a woman with nowhere in particular to be. I closed the bathroom door behind me, sat down hard on the edge of the tub, and pressed both hands flat against my mouth, finally letting the sound come up out of me that I'd been holding since Thursday morning started. The closet in our spare room still held a shoebox I hadn't opened in years, the cardboard soft at the corners, the lid held on with a rubber band that snapped when I touched it. Sherrod had left for the office by the time I pulled it down, and I sat on the floor of that room with old papers spread around me in no particular order. Tax documents long expired, a few photographs curling at the edges, insurance statements from a car we'd sold a decade ago. I was looking for one thing specifically, and the longer I searched without finding it, the more that absence started to feel like its own kind of answer. I was looking for anything official about the break-in, the one Sherrod told me about back when we were newly married, when I'd asked him more than once over the years what happened to the ring my own mother had given me before the wedding. The modest little stone I'd been told was stolen along with some cash from our dresser while I was away one weekend visiting my mother. I went through every paper in that box twice. No police report, no case number, no insurance claim, no letter denying or approving one, not even an old receipt from a locksmith changing our locks afterward, which seemed like the kind of thing any frightened young couple would have done. Nothing. Like the whole event had happened in a house that didn't keep paper trails at all. I sat back against the closet door and tried to remember, really remember, who had actually told me this story unfold. Not the broad shape of it. I knew that by heart I'd repeated it myself plenty of times at church, at family dinners, any time someone asked about my ring. I was trying to remember the original telling. Who sat me down? Who described the back door standing open, the drawer pulled out, the missing jewelry box? It was Sherrod. Only Sherrod. Not a neighbor mentioning they'd seen something strange that weekend. Not an officer taking notes at our kitchen table. Not even my own mother, who I'd been staying with at the time and who you'd think might have heard secondhand from someone, anyone, about what happened back home. He'd handled it. That's the phrase that kept surfacing now, turning over and over in my memory like a stone working its way to the surface of water. I handled everything, baby. Don't worry yourself with the details. He'd said it gently, the way a husband says something to spare his new wife the unpleasant parts of a break-in. I'd taken it as kindness back then. 30 years later, sitting on a closet floor surrounded by papers that proved nothing at all, it didn't sound like kindness anymore. It sounded like a man making sure no one else ever got the chance to tell the story differently than he did. I sat there a long while, letting that settle. 30 years of an accepted truth folding down into something much smaller and much less certain. One man's word, repeated enough times to harden into fact. I reached for the notepad I kept by the phone in that room, and without fully deciding to, I wrote down the one name that kept surfacing every time I pictured that ring's setting, that old Pell family crest. Delphine. Reverend Coley's office at the church still smelled the way it had for 30 years. Old paper and coffee gone slightly bitter on a warmer. And he greeted me with the same warmth he always had, waving me into the chair across from his desk like I was there for nothing more than a Tuesday afternoon visit. I let us talk first about ordinary things, his knees giving him trouble, my hospice schedule, a wedding he had coming up that weekend. I'd learned a long time ago that you don't walk into a room and ask the question you actually came for. You let the room warm up first. When it felt natural, I steered us toward Sherrod's parents, how long it had been since Reverend Coley had known them, what they were like when they were young and just starting their family. He smiled at that, settled back in his chair, told me a few stories about Sherrod's father's stubbornness, his mother's cooking, the kind of warm nothing that usually fills these conversations. I knew that family a long time before you married into it, he said with a faint smile. My father served on the church trustee board with Sherrod's grandfather for years. Folks like that tend to stay connected, whether they mean to or not. Then I asked, as easily as I could manage it, about an old ring people used to talk about in the Pell family. I kept my voice light, the way you'd ask about any piece of family folklore. His smile didn't disappear all at once. It just stopped reaching his eyes first, the rest of his face catching up a beat behind it. Where'd you hear about that ring? He asked, careful now. His tone shifted into something more measured than anything he'd used all afternoon. Just something that came up, I said. Family talk. You know how it is. He was quiet a moment, fingers laced together on the desk in front of him. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, like he was choosing each word before he let it leave his mouth. Some things are better left where they were buried, Augustine. The phrase landed strange in that quiet office, heavier than I think he meant it to. And I watched something flicker across his face like he'd heard himself say it, and wished he could take the word back. I didn't fill the silence. I'd learned that too, sitting with families. Sometimes the truth needs room to breathe before it'll come out on its own. That ring, he said finally, was a Pell family piece. Old, tied to a promise made generations back, long before you ever came into this family. He looked at me steadily now, like he'd decided I deserved at least this much. There was bad blood over it, bad enough that it tore at that family long before Sherrod ever brought you home to meet anybody. He paused. Now, before you ask, I don't know what actually happened to it. The statement came quickly, almost like he'd answered a question before I could ask it. I wasn't there. Most of what I ever heard came the same way these things always come in church communities. Bits and pieces, family disagreements, rumors that outlive the people who started them. Something in my chest went very still, hearing that. All this time I'd been turning this over as something that had happened to my marriage, some betrayal that started the day Sherrod slipped a ring on my finger. Sitting in that office, I understood for the first time that whatever this was, it had begun long before I existed in his life at all. I was never the center of it. I'd just been standing close enough to get caught in it. Reverend Coley looked down at his folded hands, and when he spoke again, it came out quieter, almost to himself, like the words had slipped loose before he could stop them. Delphine never did get what was hers. It took 2 phone calls and a cousin's old address book to find where Delphine Ware was living now. A small brick house 40 minutes outside the city, down a road lined with pecan trees that had clearly been there longer than any of the houses. She answered the door slow, holding it only halfway open, studying me like she was trying to place my face against some memory she hadn't touched in years. I introduced myself, told her I was Sherrod's wife, and watched something cross her expression that wasn't quite welcome and wasn't quite refusal either. I know who you are, she said. Wondered if I'd ever meet you. She let me in eventually, sat me down in a front room that smelled like furniture polish and old books, and didn't offer me anything to drink, which told me more about where this conversation stood than any words could have. I didn't waste her time with small talk. I took the photograph out of my purse and set it on the coffee table between us, turned so she could see it clearly. Delphine went very still. She stared at it without touching it at first. Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching the face in the photograph the way someone searches an old memory to make sure it belongs to them before they claim it. Nearly 30 years had passed. Time changes faces, changes certainty. Then she reached for it slowly. Her fingers hovered over the image before finally settling on the edge of the paper. Lord. The word came out barely above a whisper. She brought the photograph closer, studying it for several long seconds. That's me, she said finally, voice rougher now than when she'd opened the door. 23 years old. A faint, disbelieving smile touched her mouth and disappeared just as quickly. Mama took that picture. Her thumb brushed the edge of the photograph where the ring rested against the young woman's hand. She'd just shown me the ring that day. Her eyes stayed on the picture. Told me it would be mine one day. Eldest daughter gets it, she said. That's how it had always gone in her family. I sat very still, listening, feeling something shift loose inside my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Delphine lowered the photograph carefully into her lap. Where did you find this? In a cavity behind our fireplace. Something passed across her face then. Not surprise, exactly. More like a piece of a puzzle sliding into a place she'd stopped expecting to find. She looked down at the photograph again. Sherrod was supposed to gift you something of his own choosing, she said quietly. Then she looked up at me, something harder settling into her eyes. Not Mama's. That ring was never his to give anybody. It was mine, promised to me before he was even born. What happened to it? I asked, though some part of me already understood the shape of the answer before she gave it. Delphine leaned back slowly. I can't tell you I watched him take it. Her voice stayed even. Nobody did. She folded her hands together. But it disappeared before Mama passed. By the time we realized it was gone, Sherrod already had a story ready about it being stolen. She shook her head once. Family believed him because why wouldn't they? He was always good at having a story ready before anybody thought to ask a question. I felt something settle over me, heavy and slow. The understanding that I had worn a piece of this theft on my own hand for 30 years without once knowing it. Whatever I'd built my marriage believing, I had been standing inside someone else's stolen inheritance the whole time, smiling at church, showing my ring off like it meant something pure. Delphine looked at me steadily, no real anger left in her voice, just a tiredness that came from carrying something for over 2 decades. When you told me where you found that photograph, she said quietly, and if the ring was with it? She stopped, then gave a small, humorless laugh. He gave you a copy and kept the real thing close. She shook her head once. That sounds about right for him. I asked Theo to come by after his shift, told him it wasn't anything urgent. Though we both know by now, that's not a phrase that holds much water between a mother and her grown son. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once spread out the bundle for Pauletta, and I didn't waste time getting to it. 30 years of raising that boy taught me he does better with directness than with circling. I need you to tell me what you knew, I said, about the fireplace, about why you told me not to touch it. Theo's jaw tightened and he looked down at his hands for a moment before he answered, which told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. I didn't know anything, Mama. Not really. He shook his head slowly. I just remembered something Daddy said to me once, a long time ago. I was maybe 12, 13. Said what? We were out in the yard, and somehow the fireplace came up. I don't even remember why anymore. He got real serious all of a sudden, told me if anybody ever talked about tearing into that wall, redoing it, anything like that, I was supposed to talk them out of it. Said it mattered to him. Said it more than once, like he needed me to really hear it. And you never asked him why? I asked once. Theo's voice dropped lower. He told me grown men don't explain themselves to 13-year-olds, and that was the end of it. I let it go. You let things go with Daddy. You know how he gets when he's decided a conversation is over. I did know. 30 years of marriage had taught me exactly how that worked. The way Sherrod could close a door on a topic so completely you almost forgot you'd wanted it open in the first place. So, when I told you about the renovation, I said, that's what came back to you. That's all it was, Mama. I swear it. He looked up at me now, and there was real discomfort sitting in his face, the kind that comes from realizing you've been carrying something you didn't understand the weight of. I didn't know what was back there. I didn't know about any ring, any photograph, none of it. I just knew it mattered to him, and I didn't want to be the reason something got disturbed that he cared about that much. He sat with that for a moment, and I watched the realization finish settling over him, watched him connect the warning he'd carried since boyhood to the woman sitting across from him, now holding pieces of a truth he'd never been trusted with either. I'm sorry, he said quietly. If I'd known what I was protecting, I never would have said a word to you. I want you to know that. I reached across the table and took his hand, because whatever else was true, my son hadn't done anything but trust his father the way a boy is supposed to. And I wasn't about to let that be one more thing this whole mess cost me. You didn't do anything wrong, I told him. You were 13, following an instruction. That's all that was. He nodded slowly, but his hand stayed in mine, like he wasn't ready to let go of the conversation yet. "Mama," he said, voice low, careful. "What are you gonna do?" The attorney's office sat on the third floor of a building downtown, and I carried the small box with both rings and the photograph inside it like it weighed more than it did, settling it on the desk between us once I'd taken my seat. Her name was on the door as a family law attorney, someone Pauletta's daughter had used for her own divorce years back, and she had the kind of calm, unhurried manner that told me she'd heard worse than what I was about to lay out for her. I told her everything: the fireplace, the cavity, the ring and the photograph wrapped together for who knows how many years. Delphine, her mother's promise, the theft that happened before I ever entered this family. The fake break-in story Sherrod had told me decades ago, the absence of any police report, any insurance claim, any proof at all beyond his word. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, and when I finished, she sat back slightly and folded her hands on the desk. "Let's start with what's actually provable," she said. "The ring itself, if Delphine can establish it was a family piece intended for her, verbally promised by your husband's mother, that's a claim she could pursue. Though verbal promises are harder to enforce than a written will. Still, with your testimony about where it was found, and hers about its history, that's a meaningful case for restitution outside of court, which is usually faster and far less painful for everyone involved." "And the original theft?" I asked. "What he did, taking it before his mother passed?" "That's old enough now that any criminal angle is essentially closed to us, even if there'd been a police report at the time, which there wasn't. Alabama's statute of limitations would have run out on something like this decades ago. This isn't going to be a police matter, Mrs. Pell. It's a family matter, and a marital one." I sat with that, feeling something in me that had been braced for a fight settle into a different shape entirely. "What about the ring I've worn?" I said. "The copy." "That's where the marital implications come in." Her voice stayed even, professional, but not unkind. "Knowingly deceiving a spouse for 30 years about something of this nature. Financial deception inside a marriage. That's relevant if you're considering separation, how assets get viewed, how a judge might weigh the history between you. I'm not saying this one issue alone would decide anything in court. Judges look at the whole marriage. But it's certainly part of the picture. That decision belongs entirely to you. I can tell you what's legally available. I can't tell you what you want." That was the question, I realized, sitting in that office with the box still closed between us. Not what was true anymore. Delphine had settled that. Marguerite had settled that. 30 years of silence had settled that. The only question left was what I wanted done with all of it. I thought of Theo's face at my kitchen table, asking what I was going to do. I thought of Sherrod's shoulders easing over coffee, relieved at a lie he didn't know was a lie at all. By the time I left that office, I had a plan formed clean and whole for the first time since this began, and something in my chest that had been clenched for weeks finally loosened its grip. I drove home, set both rings on the kitchen table under the overhead light, and sat down to wait for the sound of his car in the driveway. Sherrod's car pulled into the driveway right on schedule, and I sat at the kitchen table listening to the engine cut off, the door, his footsteps coming up the walk the same way they had 10,000 evenings before this one. He came through the door talking before he even looked up, something about traffic on the interstate. And then his eyes landed on the table and the words just stopped coming out of him. Both rings sat under the overhead light, side by side on a square of cloth, close enough together that the difference between them would have been obvious to anyone who'd spent the last hour with a jeweler the way I had. He set his keys down slow, his eyes moving between the rings and my face like he was trying to read which version of this conversation he'd walked into. "Explain the difference," I said. Just that. I kept my voice even, the way I had with Marguerite, with Delphine, with the attorney that afternoon. I'd done enough feeling already. Tonight, I wanted answers. Augustine, I don't. He pulled out the chair, across from me but didn't sit in it, just gripped the back of it. Where did you even? The fireplace, Sherrod. You know exactly where. His easy charm, the thing that had carried him through 30 years of rooms, through every uncomfortable moment our marriage had ever handed him, finally cracked open right there in our kitchen. At first, he tried to wave it off. Augustine, it's old family junk. Things people fought about years ago that don't matter anymore. I didn't answer. When that got him nowhere, he shifted. Delphine's still angry about things that happened before you came along. She always has been. Still, I said nothing. He looked away first. That's not what Delphine told me, I said quietly. And it's not what Reverend Coley told me either. Something changed in his face then. Not guilt. Calculation. The look of a man realizing the story he'd prepared no longer matched what the room already knew. Reverend Coley doesn't know what he's talking about. Then tell me what happened. I already told you. No, Sherrod. You told me versions. Silence settled between us. For a long moment he stood there gripping the chair, trying to find another way around the truth. Then he sat down. Slowly. Like his legs had finally given out on the argument his mouth was still trying to make. My mother was dying, he said. I waited. I took it before Delphine could get to it. The words hung there between us. I know how that sounds. Why? He rubbed a hand across his face. Because I panicked. I didn't speak. That seemed harder for him than if I had shouted. I told myself I'd sort it out later. Give it back eventually. Smooth everything over after Mama was gone. His eyes drifted toward the rings. Then too much time passed. I sat perfectly still. And then? I asked. A bitter laugh escaped him. And then I needed something to give you. The admission seemed to cost him more than the rest. Something real enough to look right. Something that looked like what a husband was supposed to give his wife. He shook his head. I had a copy made. The kitchen went quiet again. I told myself it was temporary. Told myself I'd fix it before anybody noticed. 30 years, Sherrod. His eyes closed briefly. I know. 30 years. I know. For the first time since I'd found the bundle, he looked tired. Not caught, not exposed. Tired. Like he'd been carrying the weight of his own decisions so long he'd forgotten they were there until someone handed them back to him. I sat there looking at him, waiting to feel the anger I expected, the kind that would have matched 30 years of marriage unraveling at a kitchen table. It didn't come. What settled into me instead was something colder, clearer, a kind of stillness I didn't recognize in myself. I reached forward and slid the real ring off the cloth, closed my hand around it, and stood up from the table. I'll be staying at Pauletta's tonight, I said. 1 week later, I sat back in that same third-floor office, Delphine beside me this time instead of a box of evidence, and something about having her there in person instead of in a photograph felt like the whole story finally closing its hand around itself. The attorney had drawn up a simple agreement, nothing that needed a courtroom or a judge, just a document acknowledging the ring's history and its return to its rightful owner, with my signed statement about exactly where it had been found and what Marguerite had confirmed about it. Delphine signed her name slow, careful, like she didn't quite trust her own hand yet. Then the attorney opened the small box and set the ring on the desk between us, and Delphine reached for it the way you'd reach for something you weren't sure was actually solid. She held it in her open palm for a long moment, just looking, and I watched 30 years of her life settle differently across her face, the photograph I'd carried into her front room finally meeting the object it had always belonged with. I never thought I'd see this again, she said quietly. Her hand trembled slightly, and she didn't try to hide it. Mama showed me this ring when I was 23 years old, and I have spent every year since wondering what happened to it." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to add to that moment that wouldn't have made it smaller. She slipped it onto her finger, and it fit like it had been waiting for exactly this hand the whole time. And for a moment, neither of us moved, letting that settle in the quiet office around us. My phone buzzed in my purse as we were finishing up, and I saw Sherrod's name on the screen. I stepped just outside the office door to take it, mostly because some old habit in me still didn't want Delphine watching me manage him. "Augustine, please." His voice had none of its usual ease left in it. "Can we just let this go? For the family's sake. Theo doesn't need to be in the middle of this, and Delphine got her ring back. Isn't that enough?" "The family already knows, Sherrod." Silence on the line. When he spoke again, his voice sounded older than I remembered. "I should have moved it years ago," he said quietly. "Every time I thought about it, I convinced myself leaving it where it was made more sense. Nobody knew where it was. Nobody was looking for it anymore. Then enough years passed that touching it felt more dangerous than leaving it alone." I closed my eyes briefly. 30 years of fear reduced to a habit. "I told Theo everything," I said, "all of it. And he didn't ask me to protect you. He asked me what I was going to do, and then he told me he was standing with me." I let that sit a moment before I finished. "Your son chose, Sherrod. He just didn't choose you." I hung up before he could find whatever he was reaching for next, and walked back into that office where Delphine was still turning her hand slowly under the light, watching her own ring catch it for the first time in decades. I drove home alone that afternoon, windows down, the kind of quiet in the car that doesn't ask anything of you. When I pulled into my driveway, the fireplace was visible through the front window, the brick clean, the mantel finished exactly the way I'd pictured it the day I decided to surprise a man who'd spent 30 years hiding something from me inside our own walls. I went inside, sat down in front of it, and let myself simply look at it. No hand pressed to the brick, no listening for something sleeping underneath. For the first time in 30 years, there was nothing left hidden in my house at all. In